Hi folks, this video is on hazard hotspots. We've got two compulsory case studies here for Unit 1, and they are Philippines and California. They're called hazard hotspots because there are a number of hazards, both geophysical and hydrometeorological, that come together in the same locations. First, let's have a look at Philippines. Philippines is in the South China Sea and the Northern Pacific Ocean. It's 5 degrees north of the equator. It's very close to Vietnam, very close to China. Now, because it's 5 degrees north of the equator and it is on a subduction zone between the Eurasian and the Philippine plate, with the Philippine plate subducting beneath the Eurasian plate, it is a very hazardous location. It's also an LDC, less developed country, which feeds into the risk equation, which we'll complete later. We've also got California, one of the richest states in the USA, north of the equator, and in fact just north of the Tropic of Cancer. So whereas Philippines is equatorial, California is tropical, or just north of tropical. Now, California is on a transform plate boundary, the San Andreas Fault. It's also, being what we call Mediterranean climate, much like our Mediterranean, Greece, Italy, etc., it's very warm and very dry. So again, it is at high risk of hazards. We've got a risk equation here as well. California is also on the North Pacific, just like the Philippines. And although these are out of scale to each other, the Pacific Ocean sits between Philippines in the west, California in the east. So that's something about some of the hazards that these places are at risk of. First off, let's have a look at the Philippines. Is it at risk of volcanoes? Yes, it is. 1991, Mount Pinatubo, very violent volcanic explosion and subsequent eruption. This is because of this subduction zone that I mentioned between the Eurasian plate and the Philippine plate. Do we get earthquakes? Yes, we get earthquakes. Subduction zones, so there's tension building up between the two plates. Unlike a divergent plate boundary, unlike that, you have got that tension building up. Are there landslides? Yes, there are. Either triggered by volcanoes or earthquakes, of which there are plenty, or alternatively triggered by tropical storms. Typhoons, for example, Typhoon Haiyan being one of the most recent and very deadly. Flooding, yes there is, from those tropical storms. A lot of flooding also contributes to the landslide potential. Is there drought? Yes, there is. Drought doesn't come very often, though. Drought will occur really only in El Nino years, where the warm water that normally comes across to the west instead stays in the east, thus keeping the low pressure over to the east. So, yes, we get droughts, but only El Nino years. Do we have forest fires? Yes, we do. Again, during El Nino years, we have forest fires. How about California now? Do we have volcanoes? Not really. There are some, but there aren't really volcanoes in California. There was a volcanic eruption in 1984. Generally, no, there is not a huge amount of volcanic activity. Are there earthquakes? Yes, there are. That San Andreas fault, running down the length of California, is a conservative plate boundary. Plates move against each other. North American plate moving slower than the Pacific plate. The Pacific plate going faster than the North American plate here. So the west side is moving faster than the east. Are there landslides? Yes, there are. A lot of houses are built on hill slopes, of which there are a lot in California, lots of hillsides. The problem with this is that there are also a lot of fires. Mediterranean climate, generally very dry, so yes, it is at risk of forest fires. Is it therefore at risk of drought? Yes, it is. High risk of drought in California because it's a dry Mediterranean climate. Also on top of this, the Santa Ana winds moving from Nevada, very warm, into California, dries out the vegetation. So the vegetation gets dried out considerably by the Santa Ana winds. Makes it even more likely to become either very, very dry or even become flammable. Do we get flooding? Yes, we do. Because the amount of dry material means the ground gets baked hard, and therefore we end up with a very dry, hard material that can't soak up the water in the same way. Do we have tropical storms? Not really, not in the same way. Don't really have those kinds of issues in the same way. Sometimes you may get the after effects of a hurricane on the east side of the USA, but being on the west side, California doesn't really get any of these impacts. Finally, tsunamis. California, very much not at risk of tsunamis. It is possible an earthquake in California, in the Pacific, could cause a tsunami. However, not very likely. Philippines, high risk of tsunamis because of the ocean being above the subduction zone, just underneath the ocean. There's a high chance of tsunamis. So, in terms of our geophysical hazards, hydrometeorological hazards, we have a considerable number. So how about the human hazards? So look at these next. Let's start with the Philippines. The Philippines, in terms of its human vulnerability, is a very poor population. It's an LDC, it's one of the least developed countries in the world. It means the population has not got good health care, has not got access to good predictive technologies unless they're given to them from other parts of the world, for example the USA. And it does not have a population that has access to good housing in the majority of locations. It means people are very, very vulnerable, especially to tropical storms, typhoons, and earthquakes, as well as volcanoes. It's also a growing population. It's a very dense population because it's growing fast, and it's a series of islands. It has not got the space for people to grow into. It's meant there's been a lot of logging, a lot of deforestation, removing the trees, removing the roots. The soils are not steady. It means that the flooding, earthquakes, and volcanoes can lead to more landslides. So, all in all, a very vulnerable population. However, it's not very rich, so economically it is not as vulnerable as California. Now, California is very, very built up. Los Angeles, San Francisco, Sacramento, these are cities that are very, very large, very built up. Damage to buildings is huge. when there are earthquakes, especially in San Francisco, because it's been built a lot of the time on reclaimed land. Land has been built into the sea. It means that when the earth shakes, it can create liquefaction. We're going to look more at liquefaction in class, but that is where the soil essentially turns to liquid. It causes a huge amount of damage to buildings. In Los Angeles, the warm temperatures and the high pressure, the warm air sinking down, traps in photochemical smog. All of the exhaust fumes from the cars that populate the city, almost as much as the people, can't escape. Santa Ana winds coming in, warm winds, trap in that pollution. It reacts with the sunlight and creates a very unpleasant photochemical smog. Land's been cleared for many, many years for people to live outside the urban sprawl of places like Los Angeles and San Francisco. But the hillsides themselves are being made more unstable by this. It means that they are at greater risk, especially when there's flooding. It makes the flooding even worse because the built-up areas on cleared land simply cannot cope with the amount of water, and you get flash floods. However, California is a very rich state, so although economically it's greatly at risk, it has got healthcare, has got good quality houses, and it's got predictive technology. Throughout the North Pacific, the US have laid tsunami sensors, typhoon sensors, like the hurricane sensors in the Atlantic. They can pick up these motions, and they can tell when there's an El Nino approaching as well from the tropical ocean analysis. So what happens to the risk equation? Hazards, approximately the same in each location. Vulnerability, if we're talking economic vulnerability, California is much, much larger. However, if we're talking social vulnerability, much, much smaller. Philippines, economic vulnerability, very small. Not much money at risk there, but socially, hugely vulnerable. Much greater risk of death and damage. Capacity to cope, California wins easily. It's rich. It's a well looked after state in a rich country. Philippines, not so lucky. They might get some aid relief, that's about it. So when it comes to the risk, all in, California's risk, well, it's a relatively large hazard, relatively large economic vulnerability, but relatively small social vulnerability, followed by quite a large capacity to cope. Decent sized risk. Philippines, with that little capacity to cope, that massive social vulnerability, even with that small economic vulnerability, much greater risk. So to you, to collect the details, the facts, and all the things that need to feed into this. But this analysis should give you a framework about why these places are hazard hotspots and how human physical factors interlink there. Any questions, let me know. Thanks for watching.